You're always welcome. That was the sign that hung outside the motel that my family had owned for generations. A relic from the heyday of Route 66, nestled among large pines just off a 2-lane mountain road. My grandfather was a smart man and very opportunistic. When the cave system nearby was incorporated into the National Park Services, he capitalized on it. He built the motel, and shortly after our home, right next to it. As tourism expanded, so did the motel, one room at a time. Eventually, our old living room was converted into the offices, and the door behind the lobby desk led directly into our kitchen. Eventually, our home and the motel were one in the same, and this is where I grew up. My grandfather passed down the business to my father when my sister and I were born. My father had also grown up in this isolated motel, so my mother always said he was hesitant to force the same fate on us. When my grandfather died suddenly though, it was less of a choice and more of fate forcing itself on him. I have memories of my father talking about selling it, but that seemed to fade as we settled in as a family. Things seemed to go well for us, for a while at least. I remember this part of my childhood fondly. We lived in a place that seemed to be only described in fantasy books. My sister and I would play in the woods and wander down to the caves where we enjoyed free admission, just for being cute kids, and the only locals for miles around. These were the good times. Unfortunately, shortly after my older sister's 9th birthday, she began to get sick. The doctors in the city wanted to see her often, and it was not easy for my parents to get down the mountain in our old truck. She was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia a week before her 10th birthday. I don't remember her death, but I remember the weeks leading up to it, when the doctors informed them there was nothing more that could be done. My parents insisted on bringing her back up to us, to the motel. They set up some machines and some other medical stuff in her room to help ease the pain. I was not there when she died. My parents, for whatever reason, had sent me to my aunt's. Looking back now, I understand why. When I returned though, my sister was gone. My mother did not take her death well. My sister's room was cleared of any trace that she once lived there, and I was not allowed to say her name. Every day there seemed to be less and less evidence that she had ever even lived there. Eventually, my mother went so far as to remove any photo we had of her from the house. By the time I was a teenager, there truly was no trace left of her existence. I hate to admit it, but my memory of her face had even gone. But I remembered what she smelt like. Soft lavender. I left the motel when I went to college and lived an exciting yet uneventful life far away from that small spot on the mountain. But as my parents grew older, they needed more help, and I felt myself drawn back into that old mountain motel. I helped them for a good part of 12 years, slowly taking on more and more of the responsibilities, until I almost ran the place by myself. They still insisted on certain tasks, odd things that they were not ready to give up. The strangest involves what I've come to call the family. My memories of them stretch back to my earliest memories of the motel. They always stuck out because my parents seemed to treat them differently. For as long as I can remember, they had always visited us every 4 years, almost to the day. The family consisted of 4 adults, an older couple, a middle-aged couple, 2 teenagers, a girl and a boy, and a younger girl around the age of 11. The 7 of them were always quiet and polite and always stayed for a week, every 4 years like clockwork. My parents had even circled the date on our calendars, always expecting them. My father made sure to have a room open, even though they never seemed to book ahead. They were almost like old friends, except for the fact that they treated us like strangers every single time. It wasn't like they didn't remember us, but more that we were inconsequential to their lives. The interactions we had with them were so brief and infrequent that if it weren't for one odd thing, I doubt I'd have remembered them. But it was that one odd thing that hung over my head, never explained, but never acknowledged by my parents. Eventually, I came to accept it as well, as something as ordinary as apple pie. But it wasn't ordinary. There was nothing ordinary about the fact that this family never seemed to age. They came every 4 years and they never missed a visit. There were years, though, that I missed them, especially after my sister died. My parents would send me to live with my aunt for a bit, and it always seemed to coincide with their visit. There was over a decade where I went without seeing them, until my aunt and mother had a falling out. I was never told what it was over, but I never saw my aunt again after that last visit. One time when I was back from college, they were there, same as always, just as I remembered. They'd spend their days in their room and would leave at night, always dressed like they were going someplace special, every evening except for the last. I would clean the room after they left. The beds were always made and the room was very tidy except for the ashtrays. Whoever it was, the old man I expect, smoked like a chimney. Even after my parents stopped allowing smoking inside, they made an exception for the family. On the final day though, my parents always insisted on cleaning the room. Despite their tidiness, it always took my parents hours to clean that room. One time, they took nearly 2 days, but they still would not allow me to help. On the family's last visit, while my parents were alive, I had to help my father carry carpet into the room. We had spare rolls of carpet saved in case we ever had to fix a cigarette burn or a particularly nasty stain. We usually only needed a few inches or a foot at a time. The family's room, however, had the carpet replaced more times than I could count. On this last time, my father was tired and struggled with the work. I could tell my mother did not want me to help, but they had no choice. They'd already pulled up the old carpet before I was allowed in, but I still noticed it. Deep brown stains in the wood beneath the carpet just outside the bathroom. My mother was still scrubbing when I carried in the replacement roll. "Is that blood?" I asked, pointing at the frothy pink foam beneath my mother's brush. She shot my father a look of anger. "They're hunters," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. The dark stained ring that always seemed to exist in the bathtub of this room suddenly started to make sense. "This is a lot of blood," I said, hoping for more answers. "It was probably a big animal," my father replied, annoyed. It made no sense to slaughter an animal in a motel bathroom, but I realized that I wouldn't be getting any more answers from my father. I let it be. I figured I'd ask again in 4 years. I didn't get a chance though, as both of my parents passed within months of each other. I'd like to say they died peacefully at home, same as my sister, but they did not. My father had a heart attack, and while he was in the hospital, my mother had a stroke. My father died shortly after, but my mother seemed to hold on for longer than anybody thought possible. She was waiting for something, but she never revealed what it was. She died in her sleep with an immense look of sadness on her face. As was expected, they left the motel to me. The lawyer explained that the will was very brief and uncomplicated. My parents had no money saved and the motel was their only asset, so I was given everything. They did leave me something else though. In addition to the burden of a family business, they left 3 envelopes with very specific instructions on when to open them. The first one was to be opened when I took over ownership of the motel. The second was to be opened in case of an emergency, namely a financial one. The third was to be opened by my aunt in case I passed away. The letter within the first envelope was brief and to the point. It explained that my parents had a long-standing agreement with the family, and it was best not to question it. They mentioned the blood, but told me to ignore it and just make sure there was no trace left after they checked out. It was very explicit that I not ask questions, and that if anybody outside of them were to ask about the family, I was to deny everything. It was something I found funny and not surprising. The family's odd trait of seemingly never aging was not mentioned in the letter. After reading it twice, I stored the letter in the cash drawer and forgot about it. Shortly after my mother passed, the family arrived. The 7 of them piled out of that same old station wagon and walked together to my office. Without my parents insisting on doing it themselves, this was the first time I'd actually checked the family in. The old man greeted me as if he knew me. He did not ask about my parents in an odd way. He spoke to me as if I had always been the one to check them in. All but the little girl seemed to watch me without expression. The little girl, however, broke away from the group and stepped around the desk and knocked on the door leading to our kitchen. None of the family reacted in any way to her actions. "Can I help you?" I asked her. "Is she in there?" she asked, almost emotionless. "It's just me now. My parents passed a few months back," I explained as I grabbed the room key. The older man took the key without acknowledgement of the fact that my parents were dead, but the little girl broke down. She began to sob and yell for her mother, but instead one of the teenagers took her by the arm and pulled her along as they left together. Her sad eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt an unspoken grief between us over my parents' absence. I realised it was the first time that anybody outside of myself had shown any reaction to their loss. It felt good. It made me feel less alone in this isolated little motel. I watched as the family dragged the little girl back to their room to unpack and settle in. I remembered then how my mother used to treat this little girl. She always seemed to dote on her when they would visit. To my sister's death, my mother was less than affectionate, especially to children that weren't her own. Except, that is, for this little girl that came around every 4 years. Their stay was uneventful, and after that night, even the little girl all but ignored my presence. They left at night and returned before morning, usually without notice. Their rooms again were always tidy, except for the cigarettes. Before they checked out, I read the letter from the first envelope one more time. It also mentioned that at checkout they would pay in cash and leave behind a small paper package, sealed with twine. The note instructed me to never open the parcel, but instead put it into a safe that I had no idea existed before reading the letter. The safe itself was filled with more small paper bundles tied with twine. I did as the letter instructed. Sure enough, after their final night there was blood. It wasn't a lot of blood, but enough to cause concern. The bathtub had been filled with it and then drained, leaving behind a crimson film ring around it. The tiled floors were sticky and the carpet had soaked in whatever bled out of the bathroom. I replaced the carpet as my father had showed me and scrubbed the bathroom until no trace was left. Looking back, of course it seems suspicious now, but it was always that way with the family. I couldn't really say for sure where the blood came from, and I never wanted to ask. However, if the cops showed up one day, I'd have probably told them. But nobody ever asked, and there was never anything on the news. So I just told myself the same lie. They were nothing more than a family on a hunting trip, in 3-piece suits and Sunday dresses. I ran the motel without incident in the years after that, but it was not easy. I should mention that while the motel is located near a tourist spot, there is little else to attract people. In fact, we are located on what some call a dead road. Not a dead end, but a dead road. A long stretch of highway without any signs of civilization. It's in one of those highways that people seem to go missing on. Ours is just one of many around the country. We once had a writer stay with us while my parents were still around. He told me that he was a true crime writer. He said that he was working on research for a book about what he called the Ring of Fire. A connection of dead roads all across the country. A giant ring of asphalt paved death. He said that lots of famous serial killers travelled the ring. His book was going to be about connecting the dots to unclaimed victims. He told me that I shouldn't worry about it though, because the dead are always faceless. It was always sex workers, or indigenous folk, or just drifters who lost their way. He explained that they are considered less dead to the cops, that their death don't mean as much as a politician or a pretty white girl. He said that he would come back through when he was actually writing the book. But he never came back, and I never saw anything about his book coming out. The family, however, they always came back. 4 years after the last visit, they arrived 3 days after the date circled in red by my father long before he died. I had actually waited for them. You see, when everything seemed to shut down last year and budgets were cut, the caves closed down for the foreseeable future. Already tourism had waned in the last few years and it was getting difficult to keep the motel open. I was running out of options. So I opened the second envelope. Inside was another letter. It instructed me to keep the motel open, no matter what, even if the guests stopped coming. It then instructed me to open one of the brown paper parcels in the safe if I was ever in trouble. So I did. Beneath the paper, wrapped tightly in twine, was a bundle of money. It was various bills stacked in no particular order. But one bundle alone was enough to carry me through a slow season. There were dozens of these paper bundles. Despite what the letter said, I opened them all immediately. The oldest ones held currency I barely recognized. It was still American, but it was long out of circulation. I had planned to stay open long enough to collect one more bundle from these familiar strangers I had known my whole life. When they arrived 3 days late, I already knew something was off. That you wouldn't have known from their usual, unemotional demeanour. What I'd always remembered as a family of 7 arrived as only 6. One of the teenagers, the boy, was not with them. This was not acknowledged by anyone upon check-in. The little girl stayed beside the teenage girl this time too, but her eyes were still fixed on the door to our kitchen. At this point, I'd cleaned out all the other rooms except theirs. Nobody had stayed the night in weeks anyway, so I took my time with it. When the time came for them to check out, they paid in cash and handed me the brown paper parcel wrapped in twine. I hate to say this, but your family will officially be the last guests we host here. I explained, trying to break the news casually. The man stared at me blankly. The little girl looked up at the teenager, but the teenage girl did not react. The man did not seem upset, nor happy about it. As always, he was emotionless. "Okay," he said with a fake smile. And with that, he turned to leave. The family followed after him, but the little girl pulled away from the teenager as she stood there staring at me for a very long time. "You better hurry," I said, pointing at her family, trying to break the awkwardness. "Do you not remember me?" she asked. "Of course I do. You never change," I replied. I could see the old man out in the parking lot as he packed up the old station wagon. I saw him notice the little girl's absence. Without any urgency, he put down the bag and came to retrieve the little girl. As he approached the office door, the little girl stepped closer to the desk. "If you aren't here when we return, they will leave me. They will put me back in the caves and never return," she whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked, my mind racing. "I'm too young. I should never have been turned." Her words were cut off by the opening of the door. The old man stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the little girl. Neither of them exchanged words. The little girl left, but not before giving me one more pleading glance. Once they left, I waited to clean the room. I counted the bundles of cash left in the paper parcel. It was enough to carry me 2 seasons, but more so, along with the rest, it was enough to start a new life. I opened a bottle of wine and drank half before even grabbing the cleaning supplies. I knew what kind of mess awaited me in that bathroom. At least this time I wouldn't have to replace the carpet. When I finally made it to the old room, it was morning. I opened the door and the rising sun cast a light across the neatly made beds and overstuffed ashtray. As I walked towards the bathroom, something on the bed caught my eye. Laid neatly on one of the seemingly unused pillows was a photograph. I put down my cleaning supplies and picked up the photo. It was torn on one side, so it was only half of the picture. It shouldn't have been shocking, but it did catch me off guard. It was a photo of the young girl, and she was holding hands with another young girl, me. It made sense. Since I'm sure we'd known each other our whole lives, there was nothing unusual about me, except for how happy I looked. Her, on the other hand, seemed somehow different. It took me a moment to register what was off about her. When I did, I gasped. She was younger. Not much younger than she appeared now, but younger than I'd seen her in decades. The photo itself was taken here at the motel just outside of the office. I'd recognized the background, not only because it was a familiar space, but because I'd seen this photo before somewhere. It clicked. I abandoned the cleaning and ran back to the office with the photo in hand. Hung above the fireplace in the office, just across from the desk, was a collection of photos my mother had curated over the years. It was mostly my parents and I, but there were also snapshots of famous guests or old regulars. I ran my fingers over the torn edge of the photo of myself and the little girl, and I remembered one specific photo that hung over the fireplace. It was small and odd-shaped, but it was my mother's favourite because of how happy my father and her looked. It was just the two of them, standing outside the office, smiling. It was taken in the same spot as the one of me and the little girl. I ripped the photo of my parents off the wall and broke the frame. Too impatient to be delicate, I pulled the small, odd-shaped photo from the frame and confirmed my suspicion. It was torn. I held the photo of my parents up with the photo of the little girl and myself. They were two halves of the same photo. And though I couldn't remember her face, I knew immediately who the little girl was. I held the photo close to my nose and breathed in deep. Soft lavender. She was my older sister. I now understood the deal my parents had made.